Hi peoples. So now we're on part 2. In my last video, I talked about how SJWs can be comparable to that of Don Quixote, a character who becomes so obsessed with chivalry novels that he decides to don a suit of armor, get on a horse, and go try to be one. And how that's comparable to SJWs becoming so obsessed with civil rights activists that they want to be just like them, but instead of fighting real battles, they fight imaginary or lesser issue battles. Go watch that video by clicking on the eye icon in the corner of the screen and enjoy. But now, today's video. So in this part of the video, I wanted to show how these people can be comparable to that of what I call the nudity deniers from Hans Christian Andersen's The Emperor's New Clothes. For those who don't know, Hans Christian Andersen was the author of the iconic stories The Snow Queen and The Little Mermaid, both having been adapted by Disney and are very iconic Nordic fairy tales. Originally published in 1837, it was meant to be a story about pride and foolishness of people's belief. For those who've never heard the story, I'll go ahead and give you a simple summary now. The story stars the Emperor, obviously, who spends enormous amounts of finances on lavish clothing to the point where he is neglecting using those resources for necessary things around his kingdom. One day, he asks for a commission to be made for new clothing, of course, and this response is made by two swindlers claiming to be weavers. They arrive on the king's request and claim that they can make extravagant, beautiful clothing, but there's a catch. The men say that they have a fabric that is so fine and so thin that only fools are capable of not seeing it. The Emperor is impressed by this idea because he thinks that it might be able to give him the opportunity to know who are the fools in his own court and who are the true great people. So, he lets them go to work. As the men are working and the Emperor eventually grows impatient, he decides to have some men go and find out what the weavers are doing. He sends different men at different times, a clergyman, a captain of the guard, and others, and each man basically has to go back and say that they totally see the clothing even though they can't see anything. But they don't want to admit that they can't see anything or else they'll be ousted as fools among their fellow man. Eventually, even the Emperor finally shown the finished works and he can't see it, but doesn't want to be ousted as a fool, so he says he can see it. The weavers, really con artists, eventually help the Emperor put on his clothing by miming all of the fabric onto him, and the Emperor decides he wants to put on a parade and go and show the people the new beautiful clothing that he himself cannot see. The men are paid for their fine work and eventually leave, and as the Emperor is marching down the streets of his kingdom, all kinds of people look and see and are afraid to dare admit that they cannot see the clothing, to which one child eventually says, "The Emperor is naked." At which point, all the people realize that they have been fooled and begin laughing at the Emperor. And as for those two men, they are never seen again. For me, the great message of the story can be summarized like this. In the effort to claim they weren't fools, people proved themselves to be the real fools. The people didn't want to admit that they could not see the clothing out of fear of being declared fools, but in reality, thinking that there was clothing was the con. In a way, it kind of reminds me of that iconic line from The Matrix.
Do not try and bend the spoon. That's impossible. Instead, only try to realize the truth.
What truth?
There is no spoon.
And if you really think about it, isn't this also capable of being a metaphor for politics? How many times have you heard people talk about smaller issues rather than greater issues, all the while claiming that they themselves are fighting the great battles? Much like Don Quixote. An example of this would be feminists. Feminists have spent years, decades even, constantly claiming that there's this thing called the American patriarchy that's constantly holding them back. Meanwhile, saying nothing about women who live in Muslim-ruled countries, stoned for being raped because they violated their vow of chastity, sentenced to death because their veils slipped, and not even having the right to own a bank account or drive a car unless a man is involved in some way. They pretty much have no rights. They are second-class citizens, much like blacks in America in the pre-1960s. And speaking of blacks, look at Black Lives Matter. An organization with its many advocates will always want to talk about the issue of police brutality against black people. But the thing is, they'll never want to talk about the issues like 90% of black people killed by murder are killed by other blacks, the fact that more than half of all babies in the black community are aborted, the fact that the single motherhood in the black community has risen from 20% to 70%, and no one wants to talk about that. This is also the same people that will vote for the political party that fought for their slavery, enacted laws to keep them down with Jim Crow, filibustered in Congress against the Civil Rights Act of '64, and setting them up for failure with affirmative action, putting them in colleges they're not ready for or good for.
You got more questions, but I tell you, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, then you ain't black.
Now, I'm not here to say the Republicans are saviors. They're not. But I am saying that you need to think of it like a business. If the Democrat Party knows that they have a guaranteed voting bloc, like the black community, then they won't have to try. It's like McDonald's. Think about their menu items. They've had the same stuff for decades, and only on occasion they will offer up something different like the McRib or the McDLT. You've heard all the commercials, and you've heard the stories. But other than that, it also goes into other issues. Think about, well, let me put it this way. How many people have seen a Paul Joseph Watson video about modern architecture or modern art? That all this kind of stuff is absolutely atrocious if it even can be pretended to have meaning, because none of it does. And you're supposed to just believe it has meaning because a minority or some type of marginalized person says it has meaning. How many people can look at something like Van Gogh's Starry Night? How many people can see the beauty of the landscape, the marvels of the lights, the very nature of the beautiful movement of the ocean, of sky, of wind and current, and that the lights are like beacons greatly above us? This is an iconic artwork. For example, how many people have heard the story about modern artists that sit there and say that they use art made from trash only for some janitor to accidentally throw away their artwork because they thought it was trash? Now, how many people can, with a straight face, say that they want to live in this kind of a building? These brutalist tower blocks that are so massive they are eyesores on the environment. How many people want to see more glass and metal buildings rather than traditional brick and cement, while putting all kinds of structured designs into the varied buildings themselves? Now, I'm not trying to argue that every building needs to look like something out of Greek culture, designs, or the Roman Empire, but I am saying there's a reason why people are more likely to live in apartment complexes that are at least trying to look like massive multi-story homes than, well, pathetic line pieces from Tetris. I owe Tetris an apology. At least the blocks in Tetris are more beautiful than this garbage. And think about comics. Now, I'm just going to be honest. Anytime I watch a review about comics, I'm mostly going to the YouTuber known as Just Some Guy. And anybody who's ever seen his videos, ask yourself this question. How many times has he read a review about a comic where they'll be all kinds of people like the Mary Sue, Bleeding Cool, and CBR claiming that insert title here is some great, beautiful, majestic, amazing thing. But when you actually open up the book and look at this kind of stuff, it's just garbage. The art is bad, the story is incoherent and makes no sense, and that's the nature of it. These people give vague dialogue about how it's just so amazing because they can't dare to admit the emperor is naked. Just ask them one very simple question. What color are the tassels that hang from the sleeves on the emperor's robes? Or in reality, what kind of character development is there? What kind of enjoyment is there for anyone to read? Is there any nuance? Is there any opportunity? Or is it simply just propaganda? Now, I'm not trying to sit there and only talk about indie comics or stuff like that. Look at people like Disney. The same group of people that'll tell you that America needs to be more accepting of LGBT and minority depictions and representation are the same people who will remove a black man, John Boyega, from the marketing outside of America. How accepting. And now I get to the final part about what happens when society is filled to the brim with nudity deniers. I'm sure we've all heard the term, the left eats their own, though I will admit that this type of thing is capable of happening on the right. I mean, just ask anybody who talks about Nixon or Herbert Hoover. We don't really have much of a positive light about these people. The far-left progressives seem to live in this problem where they act as their own Stasi, constantly monitoring their own fellow people, not because they actually care about them, but because they want to know who's the next person to dogpile on. There's actually a scene that kind of explains this in the movie My Dinner with Andre, and I figure I'd let him explain this.
When I was at Findhorn, I met this extraordinary English tree expert who had devoted his life to saving trees. Just got back from Washington, lobbying to save the redwoods. He's 84 years old. He always travels with a backpack because he never knows where he's going to be tomorrow. And when I met him at Findhorn, he said to me, "Where are you from?" And I said, "New York." He said, "New York, yes, that's a very interesting place. Do you know a lot of New Yorkers who keep talking about the fact that they want to leave but never do?" And I said, "Oh, yes." And he said, "Why do you think they don't leave?" I gave him different banal theories. He said, "Oh, I don't think it's that way at all." He said, "I think that New York is the new model for the new concentration camp, where the camp has been built by the inmates themselves, and the inmates are the guards, and they have this pride in this thing they've built. They've built their own prison, and so they exist in a state of schizophrenia, where they are both guards and prisoners, and as a result, they no longer have, having been lobotomized, the capacity to leave the prison they've made, or to even see it as a prison."
Basically, when these far-left people discover that one of their own members has defected, they will go into this moment where they will immediately pile onto the person because they have to prove that they are still loyal to the party, still loyal to the movement, and absolutely better than the person that broke. Want an example? Just look at what happened to J.K. Rowling, an iconic celebrity in the eyes of feminism, and was immediately thrown under a bus whenever she gave her opinion about transgender people. Let's not forget that South Park has pointed out years ago in the episode Banned in China about how all kinds of companies will voluntarily look the other way whenever people want to try to speak harshly against China's involvement with Hong Kong, and will voluntarily censor these people to make sure they keep making money. And I've already said that about Disney. So I ask you, what type of world are we living in where more people will continue to claim the emperor is clothed, when the truth is he is streaking down the street naked as the day he was born? If you can take one bit of advice from this video, it's to say this. These people engage in the bigotry of low expectations, choosing to lower their standards for the other people because they themselves, by their actions, prove that they don't think that they can be upright like themselves or like the other people that they would judge harshly, specifically white, heterosexual, cisgendered males. For me, I believe that if we can give a chance to spread real knowledge, call out this kind of behavior, and offer the opportunity of repentance, I am a Christian, we can be able to try to change the world. I really do mean that. But so long as we have people who will never admit the emperor is naked and confess to what's going on in society, then the world will continue being engulfed by darkness. In the effort to claim they aren't bigots, they prove themselves to be the real bigots. Thank you. I just want to say I'm sorry for the long delay of this video. I'm also sorry for the lower quality. I've been busy with a lot of stuff this last few days. I'm still job hunting at the moment, and recently at the time of making this video, I've received 3 opportunities that I'm going to have to choose one of them to be able to, well, finally get order and structure in my life. So that being said, I'm going to have to figure out which one I go with, and it'll obviously have an effect on my ability to make videos, but I'd rather at least make sure I'm not homeless than simply not a voice on the internet. So that being said, be ready for the 3rd video coming out next week. It won't be as long as this one, and I just hope that I can be able to move on to other things after this subject matter. So for now, I leave you with this. I leave you with hope. God bless, good journey, Christ loves you, and take care.